kina semnol ka ke mo fa seda.
This is Talking Stations, a podcast about EVE Online. I, as always, or not always, this is Talking Stations. I'm Artemis Albosa, a member of Noir. Joining me today, we have our faithful co-host, Silver Suspiria, a member of Federation Uprising.
Hey everyone, excited for this episode. Baynex is a good friend of mine.
I'm excited to hear what he has to say, and you spoiled my intro, Silver, because our guest for today's show, his name is Baynex, and he is the CEO of Aideron Robotics, who are members of the Galente Militia.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here.
We are glad to have you on. This is part of our ongoing series. By the way, Silver, you've got stream audio playing in the background.
Do I?
Seems to have been fixed. All right. This is part of our ongoing series about what does null-sec look like in 2020. We've interviewed a number of null-sec entities at this point. If you missed it last week, I know it was at a different time than normal due to scheduling conflicts, but we had representatives of Wangs, or Pen is Out, the Alliance, who are like being hailed as Snuff 2.0. Whether that's true or not, well, you'll have to go and listen to the podcast. But on this particular episode, we're talking to a group who may or may not be currently having a beef with Pen is Out, Federation Uprising. As we mentioned earlier, they are members of Galente Militia, so their perspective will very much be from the faction warfare side of things. Before we get too far down that rabbit hole, let's go to you, Baynex, and ask you, how did you get started in EVE?
Oh boy, so for me that was quite a while ago. Back in 2006 I started playing, obviously poorly. I originally did some low-sec pirating, won EVE for a number of years, and came back only about 7 years ago and started playing in faction warfare.
Only about 7 years ago. It's funny when you talk about EVE history because it's such an old game and players say, I've only been back for 7 years. That's crazy.
And I can say that pretty much exactly 7 years because it was only about 3 weeks ago I passed the 7-year mark of being a member of Aideron Robotics.
Oh, wow.
What did you do before you joined Aideron?
Aside from winning EVE, it was just general low-sec pirating.
Oh, right on. So you've always sort of been a low-sec pilot. You've never done like the null-sec thing. Were you ever the high-sec miner mission runner type person?
I mean, I've done some mission running, mostly on alts. Obviously, I had some experience in null-sec when Aideron was a member of Federation Uprising. But the majority of my career has, yes, been low-sec.
Right on. So you mentioned that you joined Aideron 7 years ago. Were you the CEO back then? What was sort of your history of becoming the CEO?
No, not at all. It was a long history there. I joined as just a line member, just a PvP grunt. And at the time, my skills were still pretty bad, talking out of game skills, not in game. The crew back then taught me how to PvP, got pretty good at it, started FCing some fleets. The original CEO of the corporation, Marcel Devereaux, won EVE a number of years ago, passed the corp on to Ashtarothi, and when Ashtarothi left a couple years back, he passed it on to me.
Right on. So let's talk about the history of Federation Uprising itself then.
Aideron.
It existed. Aideron. What did I say? I said Federation Uprising. Darn it. Okay. Let's talk about the history of Aideron, shall we? So they were in the game 7 years ago when you joined them. How long have they been around?
Well, they've been around for a number of years before that even. Originally, as the name actually indicates. It was a high-sec industry corp based in the Aideron constellation. About the time when faction warfare first was introduced to the game, a lot of the pilots decided that they wanted to explore that, and so it transferred into a faction warfare corp.
So throughout your years of having sort of different CEOs, has that changed the corporation at all? Are you guys pretty similar to what you were at your inception, or at least at your initial foray into faction warfare?
I would say our focus hasn't changed a lot. We've always been new bro focused, training, trying to teach people the ropes of EVE. Obviously, our content changed a bit for that stint that we were in null-sec with Federation Uprising, but we got back to doing the faction warfare.
Right on. So let's talk about faction warfare then for a bit. For any of the listeners who may be unfamiliar with the mechanics or the general gameplay, can you describe it a bit for us?
Yeah. So the mechanics of faction warfare are primarily based around sites called complexes, or plexes for short. These sites are size restricted to different classes of ship, ranging from only T1 and faction frigates at the low end to any size ship at the large end. And you basically play King of the Hill for a specified amount of time, and whichever side can stay on the field longer will win the timer.
Now, when I was, the last show that I was on, so 2 weeks ago, I forget the names of the dudes we had on, and I feel very terrible about it. I'm bad with names, but they were quite colorful in their descriptions of your Atron fleets, where you bring out a bunch of just Blaptrons, I believe is the term. Derptrons, excuse me, which are very cheap Tech 1 frigates. Just you bring them out en masse, and even though you may lose a crap ton of them, you kill stuff that's more valuable than you and end up winning the timer. Is that the general meta, so to speak, of these faction warfare complexes due to their King of the Hill mechanics?
I would say generally no. Most of the time, the fighting around these complexes is not done by large numbers. Most of the time, it's small gang type PvP. So in that case, just about any type of ship can be useful or win, depending on your comp, the enemy's comp. But when both sides decide that they're going to make a push for a particular system, the numbers go way up and it turns into a more larger fleet engagement, at which point you have to kind of switch your tactics into attrition warfare and just bring the cheapest stuff so that you can continually reship and hold the field. Right,
so like, let's talk about a couple of the things that Aideron specializes in, right? So a lot of people complain about the Citadel mechanic changing the landscape of how faction warfare works, right? You used to be able to conquer a system and prevent your enemy from docking in any of the NPC stations, which was a great strategic win. But when Citadels came in, and it looks like we're heading in a direction of change, and maybe we could talk about that, but Citadels brought another thing that you yourself figured out quickly that we could use them for, mainly dropping a Citadel in an enemy staging system and building your entire fleet there, right?
Yeah, and that's something that we got pretty good at. Before Citadels were introduced, one of the heavily limiting factors of doing these pushes for systems when you needed to be doing the attrition warfare mode was that you would have to have your pilots leave the system to dock up somewhere else and get another ship. When Citadels were introduced, that need completely went away because you could just drop a Citadel in that system and then reship out of that without needing to take a lot of extra time to leave and get back to the field.
Well, also just building the fleet there. I remember when Aideron was in Fed Up and we were hot and heavy in faction warfare and we were sieging OICX, we just been making like a million jump freighter runs back and forth from Jitta, right, to resupply. And Baynex was like, why are we doing that? Why don't you just ship in some compressed minerals and I'll build you 1,000 Atrons? I'm like, oh. So, that what that led to is like an unlimited supply of ships sitting right there. You put your death clone in there, you die, you pod, you go back, you reship, you come back. And it made this like insane, like rapid fire engagement, right? Because the enemy would be doing it too. So if anything was to be said that good for the Citadels, I enjoyed that rapid fire reship, get in without any delay. And Galente was exceedingly good at keeping up with that attrition rate.
Looking at I'm trying to find the fit for your Blaptrons. Are they hull tanked?
They are. Originally, way back in the day, they were shield tanked before the reinforced bulkheads, or was it reinforced bulkheads? No, I think it was the rigs were added to the game. Yeah, when they added the hull tanking rigs, we switched them from shield to hull.
Wow.
Yeah, you still see people running around with shields, but yeah, the hull tank one was good.
I see some of your mods are like the Meta Zero T1 mods, where you can build them straight from BPOs, but some of them are also the named sort of meta modules. So you still have to ship some stuff in from Jitta, right?
Yeah, I mean, you always have to ship something in because, you're not going to have all those minerals just sitting there unless you're mining in that system, which is not something you're likely to be doing.
Yeah, the priority is building hulls, right? The hulls are hard to move. You can move a bazillion guns, right, in a jump freighter. It's moving hulls. So if you can build the hulls where you're fighting and just worry about shipping in your modules from market, that helps tremendously.
Yeah, the volume is a huge difference between moving in minerals to ships. If you need 100 Atrons, I mean, that's going to take up a whole lot of volume. And if you need to move in the compressed minerals to build them, it's going to be less than 10%. You can move it really easy.
Wow.
Yeah, so one of the good things about Citadel mechanics is it allowed for quick fighting, easy reships for your pilots.
While we're on the topic of something you may know due to your history of building your ships, Baynex, but I've heard that since the changes to the ore distribution, like in null-sec anodes, where they don't get feldspar and some other stuff, Protanium has gone up significantly in price, and like it's cheaper now in Jitta than it would be in other null-sec areas due to the need for shipment. Has this affected you at all? Have you even noticed this happening?
A little bit, but I wouldn't say it's really affected our operations much because we don't. Primarily, we're flying smaller ships due to the restrictions on the faction warfare complexes. So those ships don't take a large amount of minerals to build. So while the price has gone up, it hasn't affected us too much.
Fair enough. Let's hop into discussing sort of the things that you guys are doing now. We've discussed the gameplay a little bit. We've discussed your history. Let's look at what you're doing now. And I recently heard you guys were taking over or have successfully taken over Tama.
Yes. Along with the core mechanics of faction warfare regarding complexes that we already discussed. The reason you take those is that for each complex you win, it moves the system control a small percentage either in favor of your faction if you won the timer or against your faction if you lost it. And when the control gets to, or when the contested level gets to 100%, you can then flip the system and capture it for your faction. Tama was previously in Caldari control, and we did recently, a couple of weeks back, flip it into Galenti control.
Yeah, I love these Tama sort of campaigns. Like, there are some storied systems in and around the war zone that fall and go back and forth, and it's sort of like an emotional thing. And like Aideron being around so long, this is not the first time you've sieged Tama, right? Like you've sieged Tama a bunch of times with Fed Up and even before Fed Up. So like, take us through like. Aideron's been through a lot of ups and downs and ins and outs. Like, so you were you were Aideron for a while, and then to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the major turning points of faction warfare and low-sec was around the introduction of alpha clones, right? There was this time where alpha clones was introduced. The Kaldari leaders saw this as an immense source of pilot that they can go, and they actually did a much better job of recruiting alpha clones. And that sort of sent faction warfare's balance that was mainly Galente for a while right over to Kaldari. And this is where like Aideron and at least my recent memory really stepped up to the plate and started to make moves to take back the war zone from this bloated Kaldari militia with all these alpha clones. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe your transition into Fed Up and then maybe out of Fed Up and maybe back to where you are now? There's so much that happened to you guys in between there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that Kaldari was necessarily better at recruiting alpha clones, but as the case is with alpha clones, I think it was a lot more just about how willing you were to create a bunch of alpha alts and go sit them in plexes because you didn't actually need any skills to run them, and just having more characters in more areas.
Yeah, I guess what people were doing was you could take an alpha clone, stick him in a Fed Navy Comet with meta guns and meta stuff, and complete alpha fit, and that'll allow you to run an offensive plex from novice to medium, right, by yourself.
Or any defensive plex. You don't
or
need
any defensive plex, right?
Any guns even. You can just go.
Real quick, what's the difference between offensive and defensive plexing again?
So offensive plexing is when you are running a plex in a system that is controlled by the opposing faction to the one you're in. The defensive plexing is when you're running it in a system that is already controlled by your faction to lower the contested level. And the primary difference there is that the plexes have a rat in them that respawns periodically, and if you are offensive plexing, you have to kill the rat. But if you're defensive plexing, you don't have to.
Right, rat.
Do you actually have to
NPC.
kill it, or can you just like tank it?
No, you have to
just ignoring it.
No, you have to actually kill it, because if it's on the grid, the timer will not run.
Oh,
if you're offensive plexing.
Is that whole like the timer pauses the same thing if a hostile player enters the plex?
Correct, yes.
Right on. So you actually have to like control the grid and make sure nothing hostile is there in order to make progress.
Yep.
Right. So Kaldari had a lot of these alphas, a lot of them, right? And they used them to push the war zone. But then, Aideron sort of led this new initiative right around alpha clones to retake at least the southern half of the Galente war zone, right? At the time, Aideron was living in Fliet, which is a system down on the south side of the war zone. And you kind of got together with some friends, Fed Up, and we kind of did that, right? We pushed the whole south around, and you sort of led the swinging of the war zone back in favor of the Galente. And there were some of those sieges that we did, like you did with Tama, and that we talked about with the mechanics. And then after that, take us. What happened after that? So, we take the Federation takes over the war zone. The Kaldari kind of died down a bit. Alpha clones, their novelty sort of fades, and we're stuck with a big old Galente militia and not a whole lot of enemies to shoot.
Yeah, so it was at that point that we kind of got a little bored with what was going on, because there wasn't a whole lot of content, and we decided to take some null-sec space that is now referred to as Galmilistan.
Yeah, I just find that funny that it's still Galmilistan, even though Penn is out at the time was part of Galmil, but isn't anymore, and lives in that area. So I don't know. Anybody know how to change that on Dotland? But in any case,
on the Sov maps, yeah, that'd be nice.
So why did you go and decide to take null-sec space? Like, you've got the war zone controlled, you can farm up LP a lot, if my understanding of the mechanics is correct. What was the reason for venturing out into null?
So you can farm up LP pretty freely when you're at a high tier, but when you do that, unfortunately, the value of the LP goes way down because everyone has it. So it's not particularly valuable anymore. You can't cash it out to get ISK. You need to find other ISK making opportunities. And we just decided to try out null-sec.
Yeah, and there was a bunch of smaller groups in the area. Right, last week we talked about the Corporation Black Fox at the time, another prominent Galmill corporation, sort of leading the way out there. There were several small groups, kind of our size, that we could kind of brawl with a little bit and learn the solve mechanic and get some content out of it. It was quite convenient for the Aideron guys because it's literally right next door. Like Cloud Ring is right next door to the war zone, so we could keep an eye on faction warfare low-sec and do some things out in null-sec.
Yeah, at the time we still had access to all the existing content that we had been doing in faction warfare, but also additional content.
So, how long ago was this? Was this like 2 years ago when you first took null-sec?
Oh, geez.
Gosh, yeah,
I have
it's
to
probably
look on Dotland, but
it's been about 2 years.
I'd say probably 3,
or
isn't it?
2.5, yeah.
So, like, walk us through, give us the story from your perspective of these last 2 to 3 years, because we've had Federation Uprising represented through Silver here. We've had dudes on from Wang's, Pen is out, from other people who have lived over in that pocket or fought there. But it'd be interesting to hear your perspective, because as far as I'm aware, you're the only group who went to that null-sec pocket and is still back in faction warfare. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on the events of the last 3 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're not the only group. GMVA had and still has some SOV in Cloud Ring, and they're still operating in the war zone, obviously, for the Galenti. But yeah, I mean, my history at that point pretty much merges with Fed Up, because Aideron was part of Fed Up at that point. But yeah, we took that Cloud Ring space. We used it for a bit, did some moon mining, did some ratting, found out that it wasn't the greatest null-sec space. So after a while, we decided to take some space in the neighboring region of Pureblind. And I forget the name of the group we fought out there. Silver, do you remember who that was? Who did we take that from?
Salt Farmers.
Salt Farmers, that was it. We skirmished with them fairly briefly. It wasn't a really long conflict, and then they basically just gave up their territory to us. So that space was a little bit better in terms of ISK making opportunities, the ratting, the moons, but not a whole lot. We continued to live out there for a little while until Snuff decided that they were going to evict us. That we made that pretty painful for them, I think. We fought a lot of large engagements. I remember on at least one occasion we dropped interdictors with so many bubbles that they tried to gate their capital ships into our SOV from low-sec 2 jumps, and going through those 2 systems to get to their objective took them over 2 hours.
I think I remember Silver telling us that story on the podcast when it happened.
Yeah, and that was another Banex thing, because in addition to the bubbles, he had arranged for us to build thousands of hurricanes, and we just waved them with hurricanes as they were trying to make their way through the bubbles.
Yeah, I think in about 24 hours, we jump freighted in compressed minerals and built, I think, about 1,500 hurricanes to shoot them with while they were just trying to get out of bubbles.
And how many survived?
I don't think any survived.
Yeah, not.
Okay.
No,
But
some
we killed plenty
did,
of
but
capitals,
not
right?
because some survived, but not because they were on grid, just because we didn't end up needing to reship that many times.
Fair enough. So you got evicted by Snuffed Out. Then what happened?
At that point, Federation Uprising was looking at the various options for what to do next. We had a few, but the one that won was we decided to join up with Legacy and move down south.
Yeah, and this is the part where it gets a little bit interesting in your recent future, right? Because while null-sec was acceptable for our faction warfare rooted players in the north, where we were because of its proximity to faction warfare and low-sec, it got a bit tough for those guys and the core of Aideron, really, in deep null down in legacy space, right? Because now you're in null-sec now. There's no turning back, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was probably the worst space Legacy could have given us for accessibility to faction warfare content, because it was super far south and there was basically no way of getting back to the war zone, either Glinty Kildari or the Amarma Mitar war zone, in less than an outrageous number of jumps. So during that time, we did have several pilots who basically just didn't move down there with us, or left jump clones up in the war zone and would just jump clone out and not be in null for several days, for a week, for whatever, and just go do faction warfare stuff. That was basically what ended up being the primary reason that Aideron Robotics decided to leave Federation Uprising and move back to the war zone. Was we wanted that content back, and there was no way for us to do it while we were living so far south.
Yeah, and wrapped up in a big block war, because the minute we moved down there, we were thrown into a conflict with Skill U and Fraternity, right?
Yeah, that became a bit of a tough point as well when we had pilots that had jump cloned back into the war zone and were doing stuff way up in Black Rise and Essence, and suddenly, they're not making CTAs or strat ops because they couldn't get back.
So you decided to leave Federation Uprising. When you left, were you just like, we just want to go back to faction warfare, do our thing? Did you have a plan? Are you going to join another alliance? Were you going back to make some sort of big push and retake the war zone? Like, what were the circumstances of the move?
There was no, we didn't have like a grand plan for any particular large goals. Primarily, we just wanted that small gang plexing content back. That's what a lot of our pilots loved about the game, and they were sad that they were missing it, having to be in these big null block war fleets of 40-50 battleships slugging it out, instead of flying ships they found more enjoyable to fly.
Fair enough. So how is that working out for you? Or I should ask, how long ago was this move, so that people can put it in their mental timeline?
Yeah, so we broke from Federation Uprising last May, I believe. It was like late May or early June, in that general vicinity.
Just before Eve North, right?
Yeah, just before Eve North, yep.
Okay, fair enough. So how's it been working out since then?
So when we first moved, we definitely struggled a little bit. We lost a lot of members who had been in our corp for the null content. They stayed with Federation Uprising, and our numbers were kind of small. But we got some new core of players who were coming to us because they wanted faction warfare. We built numbers back up while we were working with the other faction warfare groups, focusing on plexing certain systems, taking them back. When we first moved back, the Caldari had basically completely taken over the war zone again, due to, I guess, primarily lack of presence from the Galmil groups, fed up leaving to go down south, other groups focusing more on their null content or other activities. So yeah, we had to bring the Caldari forces back down from tier 5 and take some of those systems back from them.
Any interesting stories from that war?
Yeah, were you fighting RVB a lot? Because they had entered the Caldari militia for a short bit there.
Yeah, I was actually really excited when I found out that they were joining, because I was excited about the additional content. But aside from them dropping a few structures and running into them a handful of times, we didn't really see a whole lot of change from them joining.
Right. So they left, and this is where I think the audience and myself is starting to get to, like, the real spice of what's going on here. Like, can you, from your perspective, what's going on? Because, like, we talked to RVB, right? And they sort of left the militia because they couldn't put down structures because there were pirate entities shooting it. What is the climate now between pirates, who people in faction warfare will call everyone who's outside the militia a pirate? So we're talking like Pen is out, and your relationship with GMVA. There was this Reddit post about Soder wanting to be, and Julius Soder, leader of GMVA, wanting to be president of the Galmil, and there's some spice going on there. So what's going on? What's the climate look like here?
Well, not president of Galmil, but president of the actual Galenti Federation itself, the entire faction. He is the only EVE player running. There are plenty of NPC characters that are also running for the presidency. But Aideron doesn't support his presidential bid.
Why is that?
We have some pretty serious reservations about how friendly they are with the aforementioned Pen is Out pirate alliance.
So you think they're like pawns of the pirates? They're a puppet organization.
Well, so as I said before, when we first moved back to the war zone, we were kind of small and we had to grow back our member base. But we got to a certain point and started getting bigger. We needed more content, not just PvP, but ISK making opportunities. We started dropping some Athenors, trying to mine some moons. And as soon as we hit that point, we noticed that Pen is Out started shooting us a lot more often. And up until that point, we had been working with them on occasion, just because we had a common goal, mostly destroying RVB structures when they came into the war zone. But that apparently didn't matter very much to them. On one occasion, they dropped a bunch of blops on our mining fleet, just new bros in T1 barges, just trying to get a little ISK, just massacred them, camped us there, basically, wouldn't allow us to mine the moon at all. And the very next day, they invited us to come help them defend one of their structures.
Right.
About how it goes.
So obviously, my pilots would have been pretty upset if I asked them to go defend a Wang structure right after they had been killed and camped into a station the night before for several hours. And so I declined that request to, ping for their fleet and have my pilots go join it. And they got very upset about that. I was contacted by members of their leadership who basically said, we're the big dogs here. You have to deal with us whether you like it or not. And either you're going to come help us out with this, or you're going to start renting moons from us, or we're just going to kill everything you own in the area. All of your structures, everything.
Yeah, and we had Pennies out last week, and we talked to Nate about that. And of course, they're saying this was all in the name of content. They dropped on your stuff because, hey, you're shooting. It's just for fun, bro. But you guys obviously didn't take it that way. So they slap you with this. Well, you better rent the moons then, or we're going to shoot all the structures. Did they follow up on that at all? Did they actually kill anything? Or what did you do?
So I told them basically we weren't going to rent moons from them. The primary reason for that being they were asking us to rent them for the full value of all of the ore in the moon, or based on the full value of all of the ore in the moon, and saying if you mine it all, will you make a profit? But this is low-sec moon mining.
You can't mine it all,
and
right?
You can't mine it all unless your pen is out and you drop like 12 Rorks and that there's nobody else in the area with caps that can stop you. And obviously that wasn't us, so there was no way we were going to get back the ISK we were paying them for those if we had chosen to take that deal. I wasn't going to ask my pilots to go defend their stuff for them while they were being killed. So in response, the next day they brought out a fleet full of, I believe it was Leshaks and guards, and RF'd 2 of our moon mining Athenors, our primary 2 moon mining Athenors we'd been using. Sent me a nasty message immediately after they were reinforced saying, are you going to play ball now, or do we have to obliterate you? Which I said, go for it.
Quick, before we continue with the story, how important were these moon mining Athenors to you guys? Was it a key part of your industrial complex or the way your dudes made money? Was it just a side gig? How important was this?
So for most of our pilots, their primary ISK making source was through the LP mechanics in faction warfare, cashing out their LP from running plexes. But as with any activity in EVE, it's not always for everyone. So we were looking into expanding to other things. We did have a number of pilots who were now using the moon mining as their primary ISK source, mostly new bros who had difficulty with the PvP due to in-game skills, out-of-game skills, whatever reason, and were using that as their way to fund learning PvP. So it was pretty important to us.
So they're serious about it, right? They're going to blow up your stuff, but in the background you're working on stuff, right? So you got this Galmil schism, right? You got GMVA who's sort of friendly with Pen is Out and tucked under their wing a little bit, right? And you guys, so now we have 2 factions in Galente Militia, but there's word on the street of this coalition that's forming. What's your relationship with Ashtarathi's group, the Convocation of Empyreans? Is that you guys working together? Is there a plan there to sort of like stand up, or what?
Yeah, so that coalition alliance hadn't been fully formed yet. There had been talks about it, about working together, but nothing had been formalized. As soon as we started this conflict and they started reffing our structures, we reached out to them. We reached out to a lot of other groups in the area to see if anyone else was interested in helping us out, interested in shooting wangs. We made a couple of contacts, but none of them were in a position to do anything particularly quickly about our situation. So after destroying one of our Athenors, Penizout came back to us, basically saying, we don't really want to destroy all your structures. We really want you to take one of the other deals. If you don't, and I presume this is just because they didn't want to go through all of the structure bashing, they offered to let us on-anchor all of our structures. So I took that option, and we on-anchored all of our structures, scooped them all up, and continued talking to other groups to see who we could get in on shooting wangs.
Is that coming together now? And I've heard other names like hobos and a couple other groups that are anxious, like maybe even chickens. Would they be coming back maybe for this opportunity?
So we've been talking with a lot of groups. Hobos and chickens, as well as Malro, were groups that we originally started talking to at the beginning of this. We formed an alliance with Malro. That's a little bit of an unconventional setup compared to what you would normally think of as an EVE alliance, because that does have actual in-game mechanics. So we started this alliance called the Convocation of Empyreans, which Aideron Robotics is a member of in every way that matters except in-game.
That's interesting.
Due to the way that faction warfare works, an alliance can't have just a single corporation that's in faction warfare. So we are still in-game, technically a separate entity, but out of game, we share Discord, we share voice comms tools, we share website tools, all manner of other systems that we use to play EVE. We share all of those things with them.
Yeah, it's interesting, because if you had joined their alliance proper, then the entire alliance would be in faction warfare, and that's not good, because a lot of those guys in Asheroth's group hang out in high sec, right? So that would be bad for them.
They do a lot of Triglavian invasion content.
All right, so we got this. We got something cooking. So Nate on last week's show was sort of like, where we welcome the content, and that he expressed his interest in having good fights and making it a decent conflict for you all. Do you feel that way, or do you still feel the fear of capital oppression? Because the one thing that Penizout does have is a superior capital/super capital force, and its relationship within it would be in the back of my mind too. Is that something that's crossed your mind?
Yeah, that's a very huge factor in all of our planning throughout all of this. And Wangs also, not only do they have those forces, but they have the ability to replace them fairly easily. We, being a much smaller group and not having almost any pilots that can really effectively use caps, we have to be very careful with how we deploy them, because if we lose one, that's losing one carrier or one dread is going to be a pretty big deal for us. Whereas if Wangs loses one carrier or dread, they don't care at all.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, I don't think their pockets are as deep as like a Snuff was. And even Nate on the show last week was like, listen, if we lose a super, that's going to hurt. It's not like a hashtag already replaced thing so much for them. And he expressed that as one of the reasons why he's sort of shown reservation. I don't know if he actually has or not, but at least it was his opinion.
Yeah, I mean, in all of the major engagements we've had with them, engagements over structure timers, primarily at the beginning, most of our content was defensive timers on hobos structures that Wangs had been reinforcing. And in those engagements, Wangs brought caps to the fight almost immediately, not in large numbers, but a couple of them on grid, notably the fax machines, which were making it extremely difficult for us to actually kill anything.
Yeah, faxes are tough. So I like this, right? So we got this very complicated situation where you may be in Gallente Militia and blue to GMVA, who will likely show up on the side of Pen is Out. So is there a war deck / Civil War coming here in order to aid you guys to... Because you can't shoot fellow Galmil even if you're not friends, right? Because you drop standings with Federation, the Gallente Federation, by shooting fellow militia members. So do you plan on... The one way to get around that is to war deck them. Are we looking at an official war deck, an official Civil War going on here?
It's something we've discussed. At this point, the standings loss hasn't been a significant issue for us, but we may have to revisit that in the near future, depending on how actively GMVA continues to turn up as part of Wang's fleets.
Yeah. So
I mean, that seems a bit ridiculous to me that a member of the militia, like, Wangs is doing this for content. That's what they say they're doing it for. There's no way that that Aideron is a legitimate threat to any of Wang's, like, nonsense. GMVA would like Aideron to succeed in order for their militia to succeed. It seems a bit ridiculous that GMVA would go in on the side of Wangs. Like, I get that maybe they've got a gun to their back, but still.
That's exactly the situation from my standpoint, Artemis, and Baynex, you could comment on that too, but, GMVA is existing partly because of the protection they get from our draw from the outside. That's what it looks like to me. I mean, they got in it iHubs and their NobSov, their null-sec, right? So, like, they're just working together, and they have for years. By the way, this is nothing new. For many years, GMVA and Pen is Out, when Pen is Out was in militia, worked very closely together. So they have a long-standing relationship with each other from way back. So their motivations go beyond the success of the Gallente militia. I think all GMVA is sort of old guard, so they're sort of not really interested in that. Like, what do you think, Baynex? What's with GMVA and Pen is Out?
I mean, I wouldn't say that Pen is Out is holding the GMVA's whole existence, under its thumb. I think if they were to cut ties with them, it would probably not be super comfortable for them, but I think they would definitely survive, especially given the climate that's happening right now, where there are a lot of groups that are completely willing to join up with basically anyone, regardless of who they are, just to shoot Wangs.
Yeah, I was mostly saying, like, for a long time, null-sec lived under the oppression of Snuff and other pirate entities. And I feel like if GMVA would to stick with the militia side of things and went with you to defend you against Wangs, they would feel like that would not be a winnable conflict, right? And that they would also be under the same situation you are, where they're being demanded to pay rent, their structures would be shot. Same thing happened to, RVB. Granted, they're in Caldari, but most of their structures were destroyed by Pen Out and Init forces. So, like,
Right.
in order to avoid such oppression, you make a friend with the bear rather than fight the bear.
Yeah, and I think that was a popular attitude back in the days of Snuff. But Wangs isn't quite as big as Snuff was. So I don't think it's really necessary anymore. But I don't know if they just haven't really thought that fully through, or if they're just continuing to do what they were doing before. But either way, I don't think it's good for the Federation for them to be just kind of existing at the whim of Wang.
So the theme of our current series of shows is, what does low-sec look like to you in 2020? Does low-sec in 2020 look to Aideron Robotics like a fight to survive under Wangs and their influence on your fellow allies within the militia? Like, how would you classify what 2020 looks like from a content perspective for you?
I'd say that's more what 2019 looked like, a fight to survive under Wangs, at least in the Galanti Caldari faction warfare portion of low-sec. I think 2020 so far is shaping up to look a little different. Like I said, we have been talking with a lot of groups. At first it was just us reaching out, but at this point we have quite a few organizations in the area reaching out to us to ask us how they can get in on shooting Wangs and if they can help us, because they've seen us start winning. I know when they were on talking in stations, you had a brief pause in the content because they realized that someone was shooting one of their structures, and that was us. Actually, yesterday, the combined forces of Aideron Robotics and its other allies actually destroyed a Wang's Athenor that we had put into a hull timer. So their previous claims of us not really doing a lot are no longer true.
Fantastic. I like it. So this is a real coalition, right? So to answer Nate's sort of a call out on last week's show, you guys are serious about doing some damage and doing what you can. Yes, and content is coming?
Oh, content is here.
Good.
That wasn't the only thing we've been shooting at. We've got a bunch of additional timers coming up this week. We've been continuing to pick our targets and start roughing their structures anywhere we can.
Right on. So we would be remiss not to discuss the recent mechanics changes that have happened in around faction warfare, because I know a lot of people in the Twitch chat have been mentioning them. Most notably, there were the changes to warp core stabs and how they are allowed, or rather disallowed, within the plexes. I know there's long-standing been a meme of sorts that the Caldari only fly condors fit with all warp core stabs in every slot, including the mids and the highs. So how has this change affected you guys?
So the change to not allow them, I think, is a good change on the concept. Unfortunately, the execution of the change introduced a bit of a problem in what the faction warfare pilots refer to as a plex sliding mechanic. Basically, how it worked before the warp core stab restrictions was that if you were in a frigate or most destroyers, you could warp to a plex at 10. You could activate the acceleration gate, and nothing on the outside could catch you before you warped into the dead space pocket. The introduction of the restriction with the warp core stabs seems to have added a little bit of processing time on the server end, which seemed to get rid of that functionality. So now you can't necessarily safely get into a Plex if there's anything that's particularly fast locking on the outside. They have a chance to catch you where they didn't before. And that's caused some significant issues for especially new bros in small ships that may not be super quick on the draw.
Yeah, there's a tick there that the server checks for core stabs now, right? So on that tick, if you're not like mashing warp, some insta-locker can catch you on your way into the Plex. So like you're sitting there.
Sometimes even if you are mashing warp, just depending on you know your server latency, you can still get caught where you couldn't really before. So
that kind of sucks for the new bros in their Derptron or Atron, and they just want to go to a novice Plex and fight another frigate. And then you go to the gate and, oh, what's there? An insta-locking Spitball, and he just wrecks your face because there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, it's not particularly good for fun fact.
What about the tether stuff, man? Like we talked to Nate about the tether change where you can no longer tether on any Citadel that doesn't outside of your malicious controlled system. How is that? Has that changed anything for you? You can still dock, but you can't tether, to be clear.
In my opinion, the change is worthless. It doesn't really do anything.
So Nate said the same thing, but I'm hopeful that that's iterative, right? Because I'm thinking that the Talos team that did that didn't want to just remove docking because that's a huge change, and you could like break things pretty badly if that didn't go right. But let's test the coding with tether, and it seems to have worked out right. Well, you can't tether on a Citadel that's not controlled by your militia. I'm hopeful at least that the next iteration would be docking. You agree?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that 100%. I think that should definitely be restricted.
Even with you got Aideron's abuse of the whole Anchor Citadel manufacture all the ships in the system and you don't even have to jump out to reship, you'd still want the change?
So that made for the possibility of very quick reships and just nonstop action fights. But the problem is that it gave a massive advantage to the attacker that they didn't have before, and also kind of took away a lot of the purpose of faction warfare. Because before, you couldn't dock in stations. You couldn't dock anywhere in a system if your faction didn't control it. And when they introduced Citadels, well, now it doesn't matter who controls it. You just drop a Citadel and anyone can dock up and do anything they need.
I feel like this will add spice also to your moon mining mechanic, right? Like you say you got a valuable moon that you're mining. If you lose control of the system, you can't dock in that Athenor anymore.
Yep, I think that would be a great mechanic.
Interesting.
You could still drop the ore, you're just mining ships would literally have no safe place to go. Because you can still use the open deposit cargo thing.
Right,
sure.
But you would also have to bring them in from another system. You couldn't leave mining ships there to use on a future date because you couldn't dock them.
Or dock up and reset the laser after it burned.
Also that, yeah.
You got to reset the mining laser from the structure.
Could you dock in your own? No, you can't even tether in your own Citadel. So, like, if Aideron Robotics owns a Citadel in some faction warfare, some Caldari system, you guys still can't tether to it right now, right?
Correct. So, if they removed docking access, what would happen is the Citadel would continue to operate as it was going, and if you had any services running, you wouldn't be able to refuel it. So eventually it would run out of fuel and go low power.
You just have to transfer it off to a random alt corp that you could then do the fueling with, but it's still a useless structure to you.
Right, you still can't dock in it.
Awesome. Is there any other mechanics changes or things we feel like we should discuss if we're talking about low-sec in 2020?
I mean, I think CCP probably has some stuff to say on that in the future. The rumors we've been hearing is that they're really focusing and looking at making some changes to it soon. So I'm hoping that we see something coming up soon, something that ends up being a good change, unlike the broken plex sliding mechanics.
I see faction warfare missions coming up in Twitch chat. I know there's been a hot button issue with a treaty that happened over in the Amar Mimbatar war zone. What's your opinion on the faction warfare mission?
Yeah, I think personally, I haven't seen like a huge issue with it, in my opinion. I think it's definitely very easy to make ISK and boost standings with it. Maybe too easy, but lowering the rewards on it alone, I think, would probably be enough to make it, not a problem.
That's interesting. This is so farmable. But I will say, by talking to all of the groups in low-sec, that low-sec and faction warfare is definitely not dead. Agree or disagree, Banix?
It's definitely not dead. There's definitely still people
I saw a Reddit post today where some salty dude was saying it was dead. Are you going to contradict r/Eve?
Oh God, no!
I'm in trouble now.
Not Reddit. Source of all truth.
It's definitely not what it was. Back when I first joined Aideron 7 years ago, I mean, those were the days when you could undock and you'd be fighting someone in the enemy militia within 5 minutes if, you just went and sat in a plex. Fights just came to you nonstop. It's definitely not that active anymore, especially on the Caldari side. There's very few groups still actively even in the Caldari militia. So while we still undock and go to plexes and get fights, it's primarily against pirate groups now and not against the Caldari.
So like the mechanics of being able to dock or undock wouldn't really affect the people you're fighting anyway. From Citadel.
No, it wouldn't affect them, but they, not being members of either the militias, can't affect the faction warfare mechanics either. They can't run plexes and they can't shoot iHubs.
If they're in a plex, if a pirate is in a plex, does that stop the plex timer from counting, or does it have to be a member of the hostile militia? Okay.
What they can do, though, is so when you're inside the plex, you have to stay within 30 kilometers of what's called the button, the central point. And if you go outside of that range, the timer stops ticking. So if a pirate that's in something that you really don't want to engage comes in and forces you outside, more than 30 kilometers away from the button, then the timer will stop. But as long as you're still close enough, the timer keeps going.
All right, fair enough. I think we've done a good job covering Aideron Robotics, as well as what low-sec looked like from your perspective in 2020. Is there anything that we just can't let go? Something, final thoughts on this? All right. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm really glad that CCP is looking back into it, because I think it's one of the best places for new pilots to learn PvP skills due to the size restrictions on the plexes, making it so that you can't just get blobbed out by 10 battleships when you're flying a frigate. So I'm glad that they're looking at it again, and I hope they make some drastic changes that help smaller groups or even individual pilots kind of get more of an advantage than just the blob warfare mechanics that are prevalent everywhere else in the game.
Right on. All right, well, let's hop into the news that's been happening that we want to discuss here on the show. First and foremost, yesterday morning, sometime in the recent past, a Keepstar owned by Ranger Regiment out in Tenal died. This is part of an ongoing conflict between quote-unquote PanFam and Dead Coalition, who have since called in their allies from the Imperium, mainly Initiative and a SIG from Goonswarm and some other groups in there. But the fight has been ongoing. Recently, it has been going significantly in the favor of PanFam, as you'd note by the loss of a Keepstar on the side of Dead Coalition. But as we were recording this show, a fight was occurring, and I like this fight in particular because I think this is the first fight I've seen where the Foons won. So it's worth mentioning the deployment from the Imperium SIG is some sort of like experimental thing where they're trying out a bunch of new doctrines, which is super fun for me because I love the theory crafting side of things. So they've tried out Foons, Cruise Foons, and they've tried out ham sacrileges, which I was looking at HML sacrileges because of the new HML changes. They're sort of like an armor Cerberus, so you're slower, but you get the advantage of EWAR. It's super cool. Anyway, right, and PF TAC looks like the Defenders side won, so it was the Imperium SIG, as well as I think there were some Dead Coalition forces there as well. But I guess the big arc of this campaign is that it appears PanFam is currently winning, or at least making progress towards their end goal of controlling Tenal. The death of the Ranger Regiment Keepstar goes a long way towards that. There have also been iHubs dying consistently. So it'll definitely be interesting to see now that this experimental Goonswarm SIG, Imperium SIG is up there. Will that turn the tide? Is that even their goal, or are they just there to sort of test things out? Who knows, but we'll keep you updated as progress is made or unmade, so to speak.
Yeah, it's funny quickly that you mentioned heavy missile sacrileges, because I was a victim of these bad boys recently from Rote Capel and Unspoken Alliance, who put 3 blue jams in every mid of their sacrileges and completely nullified 8 basilisks. It was quite nasty, and worked pretty well, I thought.
Can we, just as a quick aside, Galente jams are green, Caldari jams are purple. I just want to state this as a fact.
Purple.
If you disagree with me, you're wrong.
It's blue.
They're definitely blue.
Galente jams are green, Caldari jams are purple. Don't at me. Moving on.
Okay.
If you haven't noticed, there's been a bit of an issue with some server connectivity due to a DDoS that's been going on for like 9 or 10 days now. I've been able to log in by doing a VPN over to Great Britain, and I've had success there. I know some people have had issues with chat not working. I've found that if you just cycle your VPN to get a new IP address, one of those will eventually be able to connect to the chat servers, and you're golden. Obviously, a lot of people don't have the ability to do that, and so many, particularly like East Coast US time zone players, have been completely unable to play the game. It looks like CCP have made some improvements to the way they're doing things on their end, and so we have seen some improvements with connectivity. For instance, I was able to play the game with no negative effects, no DCs, no chat issues, without using a VPN today. So that's pretty awesome. They did mention that the DDoS hasn't ended, though. Like, the issue has not been resolved. They just made some improvements to make the game more playable. So that's good news, and also not the best news, though. We'd like this to be over, but at least we can play again.
Yeah, I mean, this extended one is hurt, but it's important to get the message out that it has improved, guys. So there's been a lot of people sitting on the sidelines who don't want to bother with VPN or anything extraordinary to play a video game, and I don't blame them. But things have improved. I agree with you, Artemis. Even my clients are working much better today.
Right on. Is there any news from the faction warfare side of thing that we should mention? I guess we have an interesting insight here. Is there anything significant that's happened lately?
I mean, in the mostly absence of many Caldari forces to oppose us, there hasn't been a whole lot of major activity going on. Galanti side has still been, doing some plexing, pushing up a system here and there, but primarily our focus lately, the focus in the war zone lately has been around this Wang's and everybody else conflict.
Fair enough. All right, well, that concludes our news segment, so to speak. And now we're going to hop into something, or a segment we like to call Something You Might Not Know. This is where the hosts and the guests tell the audience something they may not know in and around EVE Online. Could be mechanics, could be lore, could be history, just generally related to the game. I'll go ahead and kick it off and actually continue on something that Banex mentioned earlier in the show. He sort of said in passing, when discussing the whole plex sliding thing, that you warp to a plex at 10. And I want to go into sort of why you should always warp to a faction warfare complex at 10. And this has to do with acceleration gates and the way EVE determines sort of where you warp to things. And acceleration gates are a bit of an odd case where they have very massive models, but if you warp to them, you can sort of land inside of the model or too close to it or too far from it because you warp to sort of the center of the model. And they also have very strangely shaped ones where it's basically just a long rectangle and obviously going in a single direction. So if you warp at 0 to an accel gate, you could end up on like one side of the rectangle, and as you have to go in this direction, you bump into the accel gate itself. You take due to your bump into it on the side because you're too close. If you warp at 0, you run the risk of getting caught there because you bump. Whereas because the model is so big, you can just warp at 10 and you will always still be within jump range of the accel gate, but you're far enough away from the model, you will never bump. So if you're ever warping to an accel gate, or pardon me, to a faction warfare plex, warp at 10. As far as I'm aware, this is the same for like gated DED plexes, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah,
all right, next up, Banex, what do you got for us?
Yeah, I wanted to drop this tidbit that seems really popular with a lot of the new bros that Aideron trains up. One of the things I always tell them in fleets is if they don't know about it, there is a locations window that you can bring up in EVE. The default hotkey for that is Control-L. And what that gives you is a little window that just shows all of your bookmarks in a list that are in the current system that you are in. And you can use the radial menu on those or right-click on them. It gives you much faster access to your bookmarks and enables you to align or warp to them much quicker than any other method that I've found anyway.
Yeah, I like that.
Awesome. All right, Silver, you're up. What do you got for us?
I figured out just tidbit on how to help people get around some of the challenges with the DDoS, right? So what I've noticed is if you can't connect to chat, clearing your cache on your client and relaunching the client and coming back in often helps. And if you also get that message that says you've been disconnected from chat, would you like to reconnect once you're in game? Just keep hitting it. It does connect eventually. It's not like I've not experienced in a few days a total blackout. You are able to get into chat one way or another outside of the VPN option.
Also, with that chat pop-up thing, the enter defaults to hitting yes. So if you just spam enter, you don't have to move your mouse over and click yes.
Yep.
And if you don't want to bother with spamming enter, because maybe you like are in a fight, you know who's there, you don't care, you just want to be able to control your ship all the time. If you click no, it never pops up again.
True.
All right, well, that'll do it for Something You Might Not Know, and indeed for our show. A couple of announcements. Next week on Talking in Stations, let me pull up my schedule here. We've got another group as a part of our series in What Does Low-Sec Look Like in 2020. I'm trying to find exactly which one it is. We've got 2 more shows in the series scheduled so far. We may get more, we may not. Looks like next week is going to be Dock Workers. They are Are these the guys with Did He Say Jump? Is my
Correct.
memory?
Yep.
Awesome. So these guys have Did He Say Jump. They've been dropping caps around the place down in sort of the Mimitar, Heimatar area, if memory serves. And then that's on February 12th. Looking forward to February 19th, we've got You're Dunked, which Aideron may be familiar with. Apparently they live up in the Blackrise area and they do super capital hunting, even though they're actually a super small group. In fact, I think they were temporarily up in Vale of the Silent doing some solve stuff as well.
Yeah,
So we
I
have
think
those two
I've
groups
seen them
coming
up there
on.
still, yeah, in Vale.
Yep, we've heard of them, but not encountered them too much since we don't have super capitals, really.
Fair enough. All right, well, that's what you have to look forward to on the midweek show side of things, recorded on Wednesdays at 23:59 Eve time, presuming there are no scheduling issues. Also coming up this Sunday, I don't have a topic that I can share with you right now, but as always, it should be a very interesting show. That, of course, is recorded Sundays at 1600 UTC. All of this streamed live on Talking in Stations, twitch.tv/Talking in Stations. Check out our website as well. That's got all the links to the YouTube channel, of course, the podcast, RSS feed, and all that jazz. I should mention as well, we've got Discord, which has been pretty active as of late. We've seen Sort Dragon speaking his piece in our public channel a lot recently, actually, so that's been pretty fun to have. Definitely join if you haven't checked that one out. One final bit of shilling and self-promotion. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, we've got a little text scroll going on, which is all of our Patreon supporters. And those guys are super fantastic in helping us keep the lights on, run all of our various web services, pay for the editing software we use, things like that. So shout out to those people who do it. It is a voluntary subscription thing, so if you enjoy the show and want to send us some money to help us keep the lights on, consider it. But we aren't going to twist your arm for it. All right, that'll do it for this week's episode of Talking Stations. See you next time.